Hello, this is Phil Parker, and what I'm going to do is talk to you about the third step in the 5-step strategic planning process. And that step, to me, frankly, is the most interesting. It's where I'm the most excited. At the beginning, you set your objective. You want to know what you want to achieve. You maybe have a draft of a GUI. Then you gather all the data and all the code you possibly can to help you achieve that objective. Perfect. You need to do a little data grubbing, reduction, and cluster analysis. Cool stuff. But then comes to the crux of the problem. These data relate to each other in some way, or I want to forecast or explain something to get the job done. I've done applications in music, in poetry, in high-end industry studies, in weather forecasting projects, in so many different areas. It's at this phase you actually learn something. The other tools and techniques in the 5 steps are pretty standard, and they're easy to understand and very quick to implement and very inexpensive. Modeling is where you sit back and try to think, like, what's causing what? What causes one country's data to be different than another? What causes a stock price to go up or down? Or why do some portfolios do better than others, etc.? So modeling is where you're outside of the data and you're more theorizing. It's a much more academic exercise. At the bottom line is you need to have some Y variables, what you're trying to explain, and you need some X variables. Now, my advice to you is to simply cheat. Steal other people's frameworks that already exist and be very agnostic. Don't walk in with preconceived notions that you know the best model. One little hint is maybe go historic. Start with the earliest explanations for a behavior. Go back, read the philosophers, read Aristotle, Socrates, Montesquieu, Locke, Bentham, etc., and go back and understand the way they viewed the world. Why do some things happen and other things do not? And get theories, especially if you're in the social sciences. In the medical, physical sciences, biology, of course, you're going to go to PubMed and you're going to deep dive into that. If you're in the field of agriculture, you might go to Agris or Agricola. If you're in education, you're going to go into ERIC's database, etc. More broadly, ResearchGate.net, Google Scholar, Microsoft Academic, etc. You're going to just scour the literature for the subject that you're interested in. And usually the subject you're interested in is quite narrow. For example, the use of AI in music. And you'll get theories about what causes good or bad music, etc. You'll learn about people at the at UC Santa Cruz who were able to reverse engineer certain types of music and then recreate classic music, etc. And it's easy to find this material because your subject area is so narrow. For example, credit risk scoring, very narrow area. Plenty of literature there. Simply start with the oldest frameworks and then move yourself to the more recent ones. Often some of those older frameworks are much more powerful than the more modern ones that are only marginally better or higher performing than the master, so to speak. Okay, so we're at step 3. We're at modeling. And we're going to do this at the strategic level. Now, every academic discipline has a holy grail question. In physics, what happened 5 minutes before the Big Bang? That's going to drive physicists nuts forever. The pre-Big Bang theory, right? What's going on there? And science has plenty of things to chew on in that regard. Every discipline has these crazy questions. In business, our question is, how in the world can anyone make money? Because if you ever make money, there's going to be entry and you'll make less money because as people enter the market that's more competitive, competition drives shareholder value down. And as you make more money, more people enter. How can you make money? Because in theory, you can't. People can see what you're doing, copy it, and you'll make less money. However, we do notice that some people do make more money than others. How can we forecast that? So there's a number of theories out there. Let's summarize what those theories are, and then let's take this through the thought process of modeling in general. Suppose I wanted to create an algorithm that mimicked firm behavior. In other words, have a company fully run by a computer algorithm. No managers, just a box in a closet, and money goes up. Is that even possible? That's an interesting question to ask ourselves. Let's go and think about what causes profitability. Now, the very first question strategy people ask is, Why do some industries make more money than others? Because in theory, they should roughly return the same profitability. But some industries do outperform other industries over time. The answer that people in strategy often will give you is because of the industry structure. An economist would say the inefficiencies of the market. The more efficient a market is, the less likely you can make money. Efficient markets have perfect information, very low cost of transportation, etc. Information is public. Everyone knows everyone else's secrets. Efficiency is not a good thing in economics terms. So inefficiency is a good thing. So strategic planners, marketing people, for example, they're constantly trying to make the market more inefficient. They're messing up the market. Okay, within an industry that has a certain level of efficiency, you'll notice that some firms make more money than other firms within that industry with the same efficiency level. Why is that? That shouldn't happen. Every firm can see what every other firm is doing. In theory, nobody should make money more than someone else in an industry, but some do. Why? Strategy professors would say, well, some firms have a competitive advantage, right? An economist might say there's asymmetry, or there's some inherent difference between these players. There's an asymmetry. So some firms have brands, for example, that the other ones cannot have. Therefore, there's asymmetry. Some brands are better than others. They're older. That's an asymmetry. So what's the goal of the strategic planner is make the market inefficient and do it differently than other people. Now, how do I analyze whether or not an industry is susceptible to have higher profits, or if a firm is? And there's a number of frameworks that strategy consultants and others have used over the years to try to analyze this. So if I was going to build a model to understand and or predict profitability, for example, what kind of research would I do across frameworks? Let's go through that example right now. Well, going back quite a ways, let's say back to the 1960s and 70s, people started introducing the notion, especially coming from McKinsey and Company, of this idea of the 3 C's. Know your customer, know your company, and know your competitors. Very logical framework. I imagine people were doing this for the last 100 years, before the 1960s even. And that's a very good framework. You could still do that today. If you know those 3 elements, maybe you can determine why one company makes money and another one doesn't. That was supplanted by something called the SWOT analysis, also popular from the 1960s and 70s going forward. What is SWOT analysis in its various forms? Basically, the first framework, the 3 C's, very descriptive. The SWOT analysis is a relative measure. What's my relative strength? It's a ratio of my strength to your strength, relative weakness. So that's looking at company and competitor, and then looking at what? The OT, the opportunities, that's the customers, and the threats to those opportunities. So it's more relativistic. The first one, very descriptive. SWOT analysis, more relativistic. That was interesting, but it didn't quite explain profitability. Then came the famous BCG portfolio matrix, the McKinsey matrix, the McKinsey GE multi-factor assessment model, and that was a very interesting portfolio framework. In this case, we had some explanation for profitability. The larger the company, the greater the economies of scale. As industries mature, you have price wars. Who wins a price wars? Firms that are simply the biggest. Be number 1, be number 2, or be nothing at all. That works wonderfully in manufacturing industries, right? However, we talked about earlier that might not work for other industries. Services industries, the Internet of Things, software as a service, cryptocurrency-based businesses, etc. Blockchain businesses may not work for those kinds of businesses. Let's fast forward to the 1975 era, 1975 to 1990 or so, and we had this dominating philosophy of Michael Porter's 5 forces. This was a wonderful, and still is a wonderful framework to kind of think about why do some competitors or industries make more money than others. Move forward a little bit, now we're talking about the 1990s or so, and the SCP framework, a framework that was really from the 1950s and before on regulation, how to detect a monopoly used by government officials in the United States. McKinsey and Company had adopted this framework, adding a couple of feedback loops, and it became a very important framework for explaining profitability and industry dynamics. A wonderful, wonderful framework. That then has been eclipsed with a number of other frameworks dealing with ecosystems and strategic webs. we would generally use all of these frameworks. We wouldn't just use one. I'm going to focus on the SCP one. Why? Because many people in Wall Street, for example, use frameworks like this to do stock picking and things like that via algorithms. So let's look at the SCP framework. Again, its origins are over 50 years ago in a regulatory sense, mostly to detect monopolies. Strategic planning people maybe used it to create monopolies that were undetectable, so to speak. So the idea is that I'm hunting for the profit. Where's the profit going to be? Let's look at the SCP framework. It starts with this thing called shocks. The world is having shocks. We talk about weak and strong signals. You can read about them in Wired magazine, on the Drudge Report, various websites out there, which will constantly talk about things happening. If it shows up in the New York Times, it's probably a strong signal. Other people have maybe noticed the weaker signal about a new trend, maybe on Reddit or some other site like that. So we're looking at signals. Now, signals in the world of artificial intelligence, those can be actually auto-determined and auto-detected by simply scanning a lot of text, press releases, blog reports, looking for key phrases, parsing them, etc. It's very easy to do that with a number of different algorithms in either Python or R, or custom coded in ML.NET or whatever program you prefer. So we have programs that scrape the internet, constantly looking for shocks. Things like COVID virus has just been announced to be transmitted from person to person in January of 2020. That became a signal. What is the implication of that shock? Every industry has its own shocks. A day trader who's dedicated to one narrow segment of stocks, they will follow the news day by day, hour by hour on that particular segment. So when a shock occurs, they immediately know which stocks to buy and sell. How so? Any shock relates to what? The S of the SCP. S stands for structure. If you want, just write the name Michael Porter right there. He had probably the earliest and best model of an industry structure, looking at the supply, demand, and value chain dynamics of an industry. A shock affects the demand for something. For example, COVID virus affects the demand for ventilators and masks. That's fairly obvious. But it also affects the supply. There'll be an increase in demand for certain components and part in the value chain. Some people in that value chain are going to do quite well, others maybe not so well. Those shocks affect the structure of an industry. That change in structure, fundamental economics of supply and demand and value chain, fundamental economics, will then affect how people conduct their business. Let's call that the game that people play. So structure leads to a game that's being played. What's the game? It's in various levels. It could be in marketing, pricing, product, place. People will change their marketing strategy. They might change the degree to which they have production planning, vertical integration, etc. All the things that you would consider to be strategic options. Once those options play out, you'll have performance, or pie, shareholder value. Some people win, some people lose. The object of this analysis is not to say who loses. It's who wins and who loses. For example, let's suppose you start with S, there's tons of people entering the market and they're all selling basically the same thing. That leads to a price war. The price war then leads to what? Price discounting. Therefore, the people who are competitors will lose money. But then who's winning? Well, the people who buy from that part of the value chain where they're having the price war. Either a consumer, if it's at the bottom, if it's at that level of the value chain, or it could be higher up in the value chain if the price war is amongst suppliers upstream in the raw material space, for example. So you want to look at where the shock is occurring, who it's affecting, who's going to win, and who's going to lose. That's the SCP framework. Now, this is a very freshwater school of thought. I observe what's going on. I then figure out the effect it has on the structure, then how they play the game, and then finally who wins and who loses. There is an alternative, which is saltwater. Suppose you started with the last arrow. I want to have monopoly profits. Then you can have an arrow that goes back to say, I wonder if I need to create a shock, i.e., maybe I can lobby a certain senator or congressman to change the structure of my industry. This is very proactive crony capitalist strategy here I'm talking about, where you're fundamentally changing the structure of an industry that does what? That changes the game that's played, and that game is called a cartel. So these arrows don't necessarily have to flow in this direction. All right, for this video, what I'm going to do is focus on the first one, the S part. The conduct, that's really the next step in our strategic planning process. That's the option phase. So let's focus on this S structure part. The single most important framework in that S part is Michael Porter's framework. But to get to it, we've got to go through a little bit of jargon first. In particular, what we need to talk about is the value chain and potential industry earnings. So on this diagram, let's draw a couple arrows there. And when I teach this, I usually talk to people with this exact image, and I say, just on a piece of paper, draw the arrows for me, and people do draw the arrows going down. Okay, so what's the value chain? The analogy most people like to use is the one about the landowner who's growing trees. There's trees on some land. You cut the trees down. You cut the branches off the tree, and you put logs in a stream. The logs float upstream. No, they always float downstream. They float downstream, the logs, to a lumber mill, and the lumber mill is going to cut up the logs. They're going to make boards, maybe some pulp, etc. The pulp is then put on a barge. It floats downstream to a chemical plant who adds some sulfur or other chemicals to it to create paper. The paper is then put on a barge. It floats downstream to a newspaper company. They put ink on the newspaper. Perfect. Then the newspaper is distributed. Then the newspapers are collected and it's recycled. So that's the value chain. Now, different professors teach this differently, right? I'm gonna describe it the way I prefer to do it. I asked a simple question. Each link in the value chain is actually adding value to something, right? And you can see this in the form of a demand curve. Suppose we have price and quantity. We have the raw materials, people selling to the next link in the value chain at a transfer price. And then they're selling it to the next link in the value chain at another transfer price. Eventually, the end user, the consumer, is paying price times quantity, which captures all the value creation in that value chain. Let's call that P times Q industry earnings. Let's just call that industry earnings. Okay. And then I ask a question. Who did the lumber mill add value to? People upstream of them or downstream? Who do you add value to? And often salespeople reverse the definition compared to the one I prefer. Basically, the lumber mill added value to someone. Who is it? Who is it? And the answer is, it's upstream. You don't add value downstream. Salespeople will say, buy my Xerox machine, for example, buy my copier. This adds value to your company. False. That company is going to buy it. And based on its business model, it's going to add value and be able to charge a higher transfer price downstream to someone else. So had there never been a lumber mill, the landowner wouldn't have much value. The lumber mill adds value to the timber and then resells it to somebody else down the value chain. So in essence, the lumber mill was adding value to the people upstream of them with that definition. And the idea of industry earnings, many people, especially of the C-suite generation, will have this other terminology called potential industry earnings, or PIE, the pie. This is thinking maybe the demand structure is better if I did something different. I could get even more out of this market. So there's a new demand curve. There's more money to be made. That's the potential industry earnings. And back in the good old days, people used to say, strategically, you can either take a bigger piece of the pie or grow the pie. All right, where does AI and ML fit in this? It's going to be in understanding the logics managers use to generate profit. If I can create an algorithm that helps people make choices between these things and or anticipate the choices they'll make, then it becomes interesting, especially when we're forecasting stock prices and such. All right, so with the notion of what the value chain is and that definition, let's go to Michael Porter's framework. This framework is literally brilliant. You have to realize many other people were coming up with many theories at this point in history. Everybody wanted to outdo the BCG portfolio matrices and all the other matrices out there. Many people coming up with explanations for profitability. Michael Porter comes up with this 25-page paper. Wonderful. It gets stretched to a long book, Competitive Strategy. absolutely fantastic. So let's draw a few extra arrows here. This was called the 5 forces. What are the 5 forces? Well, you can see them inside the circle there. The ellipse, we have got the suppliers. They have forces on profitability, new entrants, buyers, substitutes, and the rivals of the industry themselves. Now, I don't really like the Socratic method. It's kind of torture. I ask you a question and you have to guess what the answer is. And I won't continue until you give me the answer I want to hear. Total torture. And this is what I do with my classes. I say, okay, you've seen this framework before. It's famous. Why is it so brilliant? And by the way, some people would criticize it for what I call minor tweaks here. Let's add the word complements next to the word substitutes. Yes, a complement can also affect profitability. So let's upgrade it for that, for example. But fundamentally, the model is just awesome in explaining profitability. Why? What makes it so brilliant? And it takes people a little bit of time to think about it a little bit. Well, let me help out here because I don't like the Socratic method, never did as a student either. If there's a macroeconomic shock, now all these things on the outside, shocks, macroeconomic, if there's a business cycle, could that affect my profitability? My company is that center box right there. My firm is right there in the middle. Could a business cycle affect my profit? Yeah. Do you think that was really new in 1975 when Michael Porter first started discussing this with us? Not really that new. There's a new, technology out there. Could that affect our profitability? Could lasers affect the profitability of vinyl record producers? Yeah, but was that new, really, that thought in 1975? No, they probably thought about that a couple hundred years before that even, when Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, for example. What about regulation? Someone bans my product, or there's a new tax on my product. Would that affect my profitability? People have known about that for thousands of years. That's not really new. What about consumer preferences? People no longer want to smoke cigarettes in public or wear furs. Could that affect the profitability of companies? Yeah, probably. What if a meteorite comes into Paris and smashes Paris, flattens it, every cafe is closed? Could that affect the profitability of cafes? Yeah, probably. How many things could go on this outside circle? Hundreds of them. In economics, we call them exogenous shocks. Exogenous shocks. Nobody in business says exogenous shocks. What does the C-suite say? They basically say, it's not my fault. That's CEO language. These are out of our control, has nothing to do with us. Salespeople never say, it's not my fault. Salespeople say, shit happens. Okay, so this is a model that we've known about a long time. So clearly that wasn't very new. So what was new in this thing? Well, let's think about it. There's a new entrant into your market. Could that affect your profitability? Yeah. Was that really a new thought? Not really. What about there's, substitutes, right? There's a thing called mobile phone. Could that affect the profitability of the fixed line phone system? Yeah, that probably could. Or complements. There's a tennis ball. Could that affect the profitability of tennis racket companies if there was no tennis balls invented at that point? Yeah, probably that would affect profitability. Nothing really new there. Nothing really new. All right, so what's new? Do you notice on the previous diagram, I drew in a couple of arrows there, or I have my participants physically draw arrows. And on this diagram, I say, please help me out and draw some arrows. Do you notice the arrows are not in the same direction? On the first one, the value chain, you notice it goes in the streams. It's following the streams. Here, it's not quite in the direction of the streams. This is an interesting model now. It's basically saying your worst enemy is not the competitor you're facing necessarily. Your worst enemy may be your supplier. They are screwing you. Or worse, the people that you're serving, your customers, they are not an opportunity. They are a threat to you. They're taking away your profitability. And boom, everyone said, oh my gosh, that's true. It's not just our competitors we have to worry about. It's the customers that are killing us, or the people we're adding value to. That's the suppliers. They are killing us. So along the middle of the Porter's framework, you definitely see the value chain. but it's not in the direction of value creation. It's a model of causation of profitability. And people's light bulbs, boom! Everybody just said, oh my God, this is an epiphany. We should stop focusing on our competition directly. We should be thinking not only of new entrants and exogenous shocks and substitutes and complements, but now we got to worry about the customers bankrupting us or the suppliers bankrupting us. So let's give a few little cases here, because if we're going to do AI to model profitability, then we've got to think about what's going on here. Let's do a standard strategy example. Suppose we've got a huge number of buyers, a lot of buyers, just tons of them. And we've got a lot of companies that are competing against each other in that center box there. A lot of rivals, right? And then upstream to them, we've got 2 suppliers. Okay, now, question. You've got those rivals. One of those companies has an HR director, and they're thinking, man, competition is tough, we're not making profit. Maybe we should send our executives to INSEAD for some training. No, it's not going to help. They can be the smartest people in the planet, the most trained, the best, smartest, all graduated from the best schools, and frankly, they're still not going to make money. Why? They're in the wrong link of the value chain. It's not their skills that matter. It's the fact that there's too many people at their link and they're killing each other. The buyers are highly fragmented. Who makes the money in this value chain? The suppliers. Now, again, I'm talking like a strategy professor now. If there's limited capacity upstream, there's limited capacity across those 2 people, maybe one firm can vertically integrate. This kind of jargon was evolving at that period in history because no one had really thought about it much, but we're going to vertically integrate upstream, maybe buy one of those companies. Okay. But why did we do that? Well, what we can do, because there's limited capacity, is we can increase the transfer price to some of the other competitors and maybe bankrupt a few of them, which does what? That increases maybe some of my profitability, but also the profitability of people upstream. This is why recently people are very interested in companies that are vertically integrating and creating market power or monopoly power, because ultimately someone's going to pay the price for that, probably the consumers. Okay, so that's traditional strategy. Marketing people looked at this and said, this is interesting. And they started explaining the behavior of a number of different industries. For example, think to yourself, have you ever built your own television set before? As a consumer, you're a buyer. Did you ever build your own TV set? No, probably not. You did not vertically integrate into the television manufacturing industry. Why? Because upstream to you, the manufacturers are killing each other. They're launching cheap products against each other. They're driving the prices down. It's not efficient for you to build your own television set before. But have you ever built your own bookshelves before? Your own bookshelves? You ever build your own bookshelves before? Some people, especially myself, I actually would go out and get bricks, right? I get bricks and buy some boards and build my own bookshelf. This is a freaking disaster for the furniture manufacturing industry. The buyers are bankrupting the furniture makers. Well, one interesting entrepreneur kind of noticed this trend that people were not buying furniture because fully built furniture is very expensive, and a lot of people would simply build their own. They don't do it for televisions, but they do it for furniture. Well, let's do a little audit on the cost data. So we've collected some cost data, and we notice there's economies of scale in certain aspects of furniture manufacturing. For example, are there economies of scale in the drilling of holes? The more holes you drill, the lower the cost per hole. Yes. Automation, AI, robots allow us to do that. So the more holes you drill, the lower the cost per hole. Perfect. What about cutting wood? Sure, automation in the lumber industry allows wood to be cut at a very cheap price. The larger the volume of wood that you're cutting, the lower the price per meter of boards that you're producing. Wonderful. There's economy. How about economy of scale in designing furniture? You design furniture once, a particular template, and you can reuse it infinitely at virtually zero marginal cost. Yes, there's economies of scale in designing furniture. Are there economies of scale of carrying boards up a staircase and dumping them in your bedroom? No economies of scale doing that. How about turning your wrist and assembling? No, not very many economies of scale. So here's an idea. Why don't we create a business where the buyer does the part that has no economies of scale, because that's what our data tells us, and we'll do the part with economies of scale where we can generate profits from high volume manufacturing and the use of automation and templates. IKEA is born. So looking at it that way, if I can create and understand models that drive cost structures and profit structures, maybe I can use those algorithms to inform my resource allocation. Let's look at a radically different example. And that example is the rock industry, the mining industry, for example. Yes, in mining. When I married my wife, Regine, I asked her a simple question. Hey, Regine, are you a rock collector? Do you collect rocks? And she says, what? No, I don't collect rocks. And I go, yeah, good news. And then she said, except one. And I go, well, what's that? And she goes, compressed carbon. And I'm looking through, oh my God. So I go to a jewelry store. I go to the jewelry store and I say, do you folks sell compressed carbon? I mean, diamonds. Do you guys sell diamonds? I need this 1 carat pear-shaped XYZ cut diamond with certain characteristics. And the jeweler says, we don't have that particular, but don't worry about it. We'll order that for you. We'll take care of it. You'll be a satisfied customer. And what does the jeweler do? The jeweler goes upstream, talks to a wholesaler or a jobber, goes upstream to Tel Aviv or Antwerp or wherever, and eventually, way upstream, you'll have a marketing conglomerate called De Beers. De Beers licenses diamonds from various mines, plus they own some mines. They are a marketing conglomerate to a strategy professor. They basically market the idea of owning diamonds. Now, what happens is a box comes downstream, and often that box, depending on the link of the value chain, may include not just one diamond, but several diamonds. One big diamond that fill order, plus a lot of little diamonds. And then an invoice shows up. The jeweler's thinking, did I really need all of these little diamonds? No, but I make a really high margin on the big diamond. Whenever you get people to buy on bulk, multiple products that they would have not bought on their own, that's called bundling. Bundling in economics is an exercise of monopoly power. Monopoly power means higher stock prices. Okay, so bundling strategies, if I see them occur, I'm looking at some monopoly power taking place. Bundling is a form of price discrimination. So that's very interesting already. Okay, so Phil gets sold the 1 carat diamond and off he goes. What does the jeweler do with all the little diamonds? Well, has to sell them. So what will the jeweler do? Push other rocks off the shelf. If you've ever walked into Tiffany's, it's a disaster. This store only has diamond. When I was like 6 years old, my mom took me to a jewelry store to buy some birthstones for her daughter and my sister, and it was beautiful. There was like colors everywhere. It was like amazing. Go to Tiffany's, it's a disaster. There's diamonds, maybe some pearls and silver and gold. Where's all the color? There's not much there. It's kind of boring, actually, the whole store. Why is that? Because all the other rocks have been pushed off the shelf. You don't see the diamonds anymore. How in the world did we get in this situation? How is it that diamonds became so ubiquitous everywhere? Well, it depends on the history that you read, be it in a book or elsewhere, but De Beers had some part of this in form of product placement, especially after World War II. When Hollywood was taking off, you started noticing diamonds being placed in certain types of movies, all of a sudden becoming much more popular. My favorite movie on this subject is Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. It stars Marilyn Monroe, and in that movie, she sings a song. Diamonds are a girl's best friend. In other words, the hamster you're about to marry, that dude is going to dump you, but you get to keep the diamond. In the world of pricing strategy, that's called an activation fee. So if you want to get in bed with me, you need to pay the price first. So how did this happen? These songs were being introduced, and in particular, diamonds are a girl's best friend. This song literally says, the lyrics, if you have a chance to watch it on YouTube, please do. It starts with her singing about how you promised me this, you want that. Listen, I want a diamond. I've got to pay the rent. I've got to do this. Give me the diamond. You're promising me this, but one day I'm going to get old and you're going to dump me, so give me the diamond now. It is brutal, that song. It even lists retailers, Harry Winston, Tiffany, etc. It's amazing. So what happened was, after these movies started showing up in the 1950s, women would walk up to American men and say, where's my diamond? Where's my diamond? I was like, what do you mean? What do you need a diamond for? What is that all about? We didn't need diamonds to get married. Way back 150 years ago, no one would have gotten married if we needed diamonds, right? This is a relatively new phenomenon in human history, this diamond thing. And of course, men are kind of smart. So they'd give a diamond ring, right? But it would be a really tiny diamond, and the woman would look at it and go, I'm worth more than that. And there was a culture that happened where you needed to dedicate at least 1 month of salary into the diamond to show that you were very serious. There's of course been inflation, and now it's 3 months. Recently, my wife had this 30th wedding anniversary with me, and she strategically left magazines around the house. There's something called the trilogy. It's not one diamond now, it's 3: past, present, and future. Brutal. 3 diamonds. The best example I've ever seen of this, of manipulating the value chain, is in a hunting magazine. I'm in an airplane in America, and I'm flipping through this hunting magazines. It has really cool stuff, Bowie knives, fly fishing equipment, rifle scopes, all this kind of hunting masculine kind of products. And then out of the blue, a De Beers commercial. And you see 2 beautiful diamond earrings, absolutely stunning. And above it, it says, just how desperate are you to go hunting this weekend? Brutal way of shifting the demand curve. So Michael Porter's framework has made people think, should I worry about the people in my little box, or should I go to another box and maybe have a strategy for those other boxes? The people who are clever at this, of course, are making the most profit. So let's investigate the 5 forces now. And what is the force we really need to worry about? In a program I was conducting for McKinsey & Company, I was asked to talk about this Porter framework and really focus on just a few forces. What are the key forces we need to think about? Now, this diagram summarizes the 5 forces framework and the 300-page book written by Michael Porter. And what you'll notice is that each of the forces have a number of factors that drive power. Power is loosely can be interpreted as the long-run profitability of a player in that market. Okay, so what determines the supplier's power, profitability in the long run? Go down the list and you'll notice that the word switching cost is there. So let's highlight that. Now, what determines the ability of a new entrant to affect my profitability? Go down the list and you'll see the word switching cost. What affects the buyer's ability to keep money in their pockets? Go down that list and you're going to see the word switching cost again. What determines substitutes' abilities to affect my profits? And you're going to see, oh my gosh, switching cost. And what determines the rival's ability to keep profit in their profit? You're going to see the word switching cost. Many people had a tough time reading Michael Porter's book, 300 pages. Very hard to get past chapter 3 because it was almost like you were reading the same book over and over again. Because there's not really 5 forces here. There's one underlying mega force that actually explains a lot about profitability. And unfortunately, it doesn't have a very sexy name, but for the moment, let's just call it a cross-price elasticity for the sake of argument. So on the horizontal axis, we have the units we're selling. On the vertical, we have the relative prices between competitors. Now, if the curve between these 2 variables is extremely steep, inelastic, as we call it, that means whether someone changes their price or not has very little effect on my sales. For example, if I'm selling heroin, whether or not champagne changes its price very much doesn't really affect me very much. Why? Because people are addicted to my product. As opposed to curve B. Curve B says that if someone changes their price, it has a dramatic effect on my sales. If I look at champagne versus sparkling wine. If champagne drops its price a lot, that could have a big impact on sparkling wines, for example, inelastic. So everyone faces a different curve. The question is, what shifts that curve? Switching cost is an example of one of the things that shifts that curve. Maybe branding, maybe patents, trademarks, certain kinds of factors in the market allows that curve to shift. If you want to step pretty far back, who makes the money down a value chain? Well, it's pretty simple. It's the company who faces the steepest curve where upstream people are beating each other up. So it's the delta between two curves, the one I'm facing and the one upstream to me. If the people upstream are facing flat curves, they're just basically beating each other up. I therefore get very inexpensive raw materials. If I'm facing a steep curve, then I'm actually having a price premium and I'll get high margins. There we go. Now, despite that simplicity, I'm really being a reductionist now. With that reductionist view, there's only a few variables that matter here. Probably number one, the number of entrants that you have. That's always an important factor you need to think about. The second one is the switching cost. Is it easy for me to go from one supplier to another supplier? And the third one is barriers to entry. Those three words seem to appear over and over again across the five forces. So what exactly are entry barriers? Entry barriers, my favorite definition, comes from McKinsey. I'm ripping off their definition shamelessly. It's basically doing anything that makes your business look bad to someone else is a barrier to entry. And a quick review of the literature reveals a number of things. For example, lower cost structure. If lower costs are important in your industry, having a steep learning curve, for example, the person who's gone the farthest down that curve has a low cost structure. Any new entrant who comes into the market will have a high cost structure, which means incumbents can always outprice them. Now, of course, a new entrant can still enter. They simply have to have a premium product. Nokia had massive volumes and therefore low costs in manufacturing mobile phones. Apple walked in, had a premium product, very high. They needed to because they had very little volumes at the beginning. They did have a big attempt to reduce the amount of cost they had, and that means that maybe the curve that they're using is a different curve than the incumbents. And that's also a reason why costs are not necessarily a barrier to entry. A couple other ones that people talk about is lower delivery costs, being able to have efficiencies or economies in delivering. Carrefour and hypermarkets have lower incremental delivery costs because of their bulk purchases than other competitors. This is why in many countries, small shop owners don't want mega malls or mega shops like that opening up nearby because they simply can't compete. Centralized overhead is another classic one. In the world of big data and IT, this is what companies like Dun & Bradstreet and other firms, especially financial firms, etc., by centralizing your overhead, it allows you to incrementally serve new customers quite inexpensively. Because you can serve them inexpensively, local competitors, let's say in Indonesia, which don't have global footprints and centralized overheads, have a very tough time competing. There's also economies of scope. Having a lot of products on the shelf could be an economy of scope that can prevent people from entering. You're an entrepreneur and you've got a new can of soap or a new can of soup, for example. You go to Carrefour and try to sell it. They'll say, hey, you've got to pay for shelf allotment for that. You're going to say, what? I have to pay to put my product in Carrefour? Yeah, kind of. Whereas a company that has thousands of soups or Procter & Gamble with thousands of products, their cost to place new products at retail is far lower. So entrepreneurs end up going to small boutiques, proving themselves, then getting into the big box stores, and then hopefully getting economies of scale and economies of scope. Reputation, for example, suing people that come to your business, that can be a barrier to entry. Controlling resources, having access to mines or things like that, or oil reserves, etc., can be a barrier to entry for others. Claiming you're the first into an industry, being a pioneer, making it expensive for people to exit if they have to post a bond to enter a market, and that bond isn't paid by the people already in the industry, that's a barrier to entry. Having family connections, having the crown prince as your distributor often can be advantageous to people entering a market. If they've got that license, everyone else has a tough time entering. If you've ever seen The Sopranos, there's a number of things that people can do to keep people out of your business, etc. So barriers to entry are everywhere. All right, so we've set the stage. If we wanted to do modeling to understand profitability, what are we talking about? We need to have algorithms that do what? That scan the shocks. Those shocks are going to affect the steepness of the demand curves across different players in the market. We would need to have modelers have models that would mimic that. That would be supervised machine learning models most likely. And at the end of the day, we're going to buy and sell stocks based on what? our perceived profitability of the different players. Some people are winning, some people are losing. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to evaluate the data coming in and modeling its impact at the end of that chain, a series of different models. Now, in the next video, we're going to talk about a case study, and it shows how difficult this modeling is. Why in the world are some people profitable? If you don't have a story to back up your modeling in step 4, where you're going to do this supervised machine learning, don't do supervised machine learning. Have a fundamental understanding of what you believe causes activities in your data sets. We need to know what drives why. As we discussed earlier, if you have the wrong X's, you have a specification error, which means the conclusions you draw may be incorrect. I've seen many models where people simply have data that are highly correlated to each other. If you can't forecast those X's, then you literally can't forecast the Y's. You need to know what precedes, what's a leading indicator of your Y's. That's a causal model. So this modeling phase, even though we might use neural networks as a black box, we still need to know what to feed the beast, so to speak. And so in our next video, we're going to talk about a case study of a company called OAG, and then I'm going to deliver to you after the case the single most important framework in business. If you only had to listen to a professor for half an hour on one framework, that's the framework after the OAG case study. But you have to watch that case study to appreciate the framework. So I'll talk to you in just a couple of minutes. See you soon. Bye-bye.